Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined for a second time, by the now Dr. Nicole Barbaro. She is educational research scientist at WGU Labs and Adjunct Professor at Utah Valley University and the Communications Officer for the Human Behavior and Evolution Society. Her interests are in human sexual psychology and behavior, and today we're going to focus on attachment theory and behavioral genetics mostly. So, Nicole, welcome to the show again. Thank you for taking the time.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me again.
Okay, great. So, last time we also talked a bit about attachment theory, but just as a sort of reminder, what are the styles of attachment that we have in humans?
Yeah, so the way that we conceptualize attachment is going to differ, if we're talking about small children versus adults. And in small children, we typically still use more categorical measurements. So we kind of have these four categories, one being, some sort of title around anxious attachment. So, a child is kind of unpredictable in their behavior. With their parent, they don't like, being separated from their parent. It makes them very upset. We have, this avoidant type attachment, which typically the child's in a way indifferent if the parent, leaves or they're on their own. We have disorganized, which is exactly what it means is, there's no clear-cut way that the child behaves. It's very unpredictable in most situations. And then a secure attachment. So, most children do enjoy being around their parents, are upset, a little bit when they leave, but tend to be able to figure things out, and then they're happy when they return. So these four styles have kind of been mapped onto how social psychologists and evolutionary psychologists typically conceptualize attachment in adults. But because we don't put adults in small rooms and take their parents away from them or their romantic partners away from them, we typically use self-report measures, which allows us to look at attachment in adults on a continuum, which is typically how we look at various different types of individual difference traits on a continuum rather than categorical. And in adults, these dimensions of attachment fall along the anxious attachment dimension and the avoidant attachment dimension. And so adults can be high or low or somewhere in between on both of these dimensions. They're supposed to be orthogonal dimensions. So what's interesting is when you look at these two dimensions, you can kind of map them onto these four categories that we have been using for infants for decades. So they can be highly, kind of rate high on the anxious dimension and the avoidant dimension that kind of maps onto that disorganized attachment. You can be high on the anxious and low on the avoidant, mapping onto anxious. Vice versa with avoidant, and then you can be kind of low on both, so you're securely attached to your partner. You're safe to explore without them. You prefer them around rather than not, but you're not super anxious when they leave, and you also care that they're not there as well. So we use these four categories in young children with more observational measures, and then typically in adults we use the self-report measures and conceptualize attachment on these dimensions rather than categories.
Mm-hmm. So is attachment primarily established between the person and her parents or not?
Yeah, so this is kind of an area that there's a lot of work going on in terms of who is the attachment figure or who are the attachment figures. And from my reading, the perspective is that we can obviously have multiple attachment figures, and these tend to be caregivers for young children, so infants and toddlers. These tend to be the kind of regular caregivers. Most of the research is done with mothers, simply because mothers are most often with their young children. So by nature of, most family settings, mothers are typically used in research. But that's not to say that children don't form attachment with fathers. There are some studies with looking at specifically father attachment. But typically, we assume that children have attachments to various caregivers, and they can be a little bit different. So if a child's anxiously attached to the mother, it doesn't necessarily mean they're anxiously attached to the father or, say a close aunt or uncle or a grandparent that may be taking care of them regularly. But it seems to be more the consensus that there's multiple attachment figures. and children are most likely to form attachments to caregivers that they're around regularly. So anyone that is regularly taking care of the child, we would consider an attachment figure.
But are these attachment styles learned in any way?
Yeah, so that's an interesting kind of area for young children, with how these attachment styles develop. Typically, from the best longitudinal research that I've read on how attachment develops, especially in young children, is typically in the first year or two, it's a little unreliable. So if we were to try and observe an infant's attachment behavior at 6 months to 8 months, it's going to be, a little bit different. That 6-month observation may not correlate very well to the 8-month observation or the 1 year. And what seems to be the case is that the attachment system is relatively open in that first year or two, which makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, because children or infants really are so dependent on parents for survival. It makes sense to have a little bit more open of a system, so to learn who is a reliable caregiver, who's around, and then those attachments form over about the first 2 years. And what we notice in the longitudinal research is about at 2 years, those attachment bonds seem to be relatively reliable and well developed with those regular caregivers. So it does take some time. They seem to have a little bit more open of a system to learn who's reliable, who's around, and who can, you depend on for, feeding and protection and other emotional needs. And then those attachments start to kind of stabilize around 2 years or so.
And does attachment have a genetic component to it?
My favorite question this year is whether attachment has a genetic component. So I do have a new preprint out that's kind of evaluating the literature. It's has an invited revision right now, so I still need to revise that manuscript. But interestingly, attachment has, compared to other areas in psychology, we have very little behavior genetic data. And when I say behavior genetic data, I'm primarily referring to twin studies, which is kind of the classical method by which we evaluate the heritability of any particular trait. And what's been really surprising about that literature is that, things like personality, we have a wealth of data on pretty much any construct, self-report construct in psychology. We have many, many studies. When we look at the attachment literature, we see about a dozen studies across the lifespan. So starting from infants all the way to adults on using a twin study to evaluate heritability, which, given how large of an area attachment research is, it's very surprising. It's very out of proportion with how much research has been done on attachment across developmental psychology and social psychology and evolutionary psychology. So from that research, we see, especially in adolescence onward, there seems to be a reliable genetic component or heritability estimate that is around 0.4 or so, which is pretty standard for most psychology traits. On average, we see that, any kind of any trait, if you were to randomly pick a heritability estimate, it's probably going to be around 0.4 to 0.5. The literature is a little bit more debated for young children. So that infant attachment to adults, we don't have very good sample sizes for that. And the few studies that we have, which are very, very low statistical power, there's, 50 twins in these studies. And using a categorical measure means we need even more. So to actually have an appropriate heritability estimate, we would need 1,000 twins. So the samples that we have are maybe 50 to 100. And those samples yield no heritability estimate. But as I make the argument in the paper, we actually don't have well-powered experiments to actually say that estimate's reliable or not. So I would say that yes, it does have a genetic component, and infant attachment is heritable. That would be my best hypothesis, but our research that we have available isn't very conclusive on it right now.
Fair enough. Okay, so do we know anything about the effects coming from the shared and non-shared environment? Do we have any estimates for them?
Yeah, so again, in adolescents and adults, attachment looks just like every other trait that we have, solid twin study or genetic data from, in that we see a moderate heritability estimate, very low, most of the time zero impact of the shared environment. And then we see the rest of it mostly accounted for by the non-shared environment, or those unique experiences that individuals have that influence the development of that particular trait. In infancy, again, what we see is, again, a large component of the non-shared environment. So as with everything that we know about in psychology and behavioral genetics, everything has a substantial impact from this non-shared or unique environment variance. But with the infant attachment, we do see in, again, these small studies, we do see a significant non-shared environmental component. And this is where a lot of researchers in that area are claiming that attachment may be a little bit unique or a little bit different than other traits that we know, because it is showing this non-shared environmental component variance. I'm not fully convinced that the data are going to keep yielding that estimate as the sample sizes increase, though.
What is the relationship between attachment and personality? Is the style of attachment a personality trait?
That's a great question. So it really depends on who you ask and how attachment is conceptualized. So this is an area that I don't think there's a full consensus across the different areas. So one thing that's interesting about the attachment literature is we do have kind of, I say, three buckets of attachment research. We have the kind of classical developmental psychologists who are mostly focusing on infant and parent attachment, using the strange situation procedure, very influenced by Bowlby and Ainsworth, and that really, foundational attachment work in a very traditional developmental approach. And then we have the social psychology bucket, which seems to conceptualize attachment more as a style or a trait. So there's this trait-like implicit assumption that attachment is something that develops with some influence over those early attachments. It's kind of a reliable individual difference trait, if you will, that has influence on how individuals form other relationships and, specifically more romantic style relationships in adulthood. And then we have the evolutionary psychology bucket, which does use the same measures as social psychologists for attachment, and broadly does conceptualize it as a trait, but has a little bit more, in general, kind of the adaptive focus. What is, the selection pressures that have given rise to that. So it's still conceptualized similarly in this trait-like way, and it's bridged a little bit more into life history theory. But while I don't think it's not useful to conceptualize it like that, I also think we have a relatively limited focus on the fact that, especially in romantic pair bonds, that attachment between an individual and their romantic partner is going to be very specific to that relationship. And I like to look at it more as a specific bond with that person, though there does seem to be some underlying stability that you could conceptualize somewhat as a personality trait. And interestingly, we do see, specifically with highly anxious individuals that score highly on that anxious attachment dimension, we see a strong correlation between the anxious attachment dimension and neuroticism, specifically of the Big Five or the Hexaco style model of personality. So there does seem to be a strong correlation between neuroticism and anxiety, but we don't have as strong of a correlation between the avoidant attachment style and any of these typical personality traits. So broadly, it's usually measured and conceptualized more as like a trait or an individual difference factor. But I like to look at it, especially with the romantic attachments, as more of a dyadic bond that we need to evaluate, as opposed to a general style that has an influence over these different types of relationships.
So let me just see if I get this bit right. So does that mean then that we have different styles of attachment that we establish with different people?
I would say so, yeah. So we see this in the young infant and child relationships as well that I mentioned at the beginning, where infants can have different, variation in how they're attached to different caregivers. So the mother versus the father. And even when we look at self-report of attachment styles, Chris Fraley's done some great work on this with large sample sizes, that if you give the same attachment measure and make it specific to a person, so rather than saying, and this is the typical wording, of the experiences in close relationship scale, which is kind of the standard measure of attachment in adolescents and adults, if you ask them, what I generally feel uncomfortable, being intimate with a romantic partner, that would be a general question. And, if you ask it that way, people are going to fill in one of the bubbles and you're going to get a response for it, but it doesn't make it true that it is a style. Whereas if you ask that same question, if you give them, the same scale, but insert a specific name, like I feel this way about my mother versus my father versus my best friend versus my romantic partner, now you're going to start to see some variation. And there tends to be correlations between how one reports that they are attached to their mother or their father and their romantic partner. But these correlations are generally pretty small. You would expect, if it was really a truly individual difference type trait, a pretty moderate to large correlation between how one feels on these attachment style questions toward these different, people in their lives. Whereas when you actually ask them these questions, you see a pretty small correlation, around 0.15 to 0.2, which, it's there and it's significant, but that's a very small amount of overlap in the big picture. So I would argue that these, there may be some underlying kind of small stability component to it that may influence how an individual kind of approaches relationships at first. But that person that you're in that relationship with is, a massive dose of variance that should, by all logic, influence how you feel about that person. And I think that bond, that kind of dyadic bond, can sometimes be lost. And it may just be a limitation of how we measure things. It's harder to get dyads in the lab than it is to get an individual person. So limitations of measurement can kind of warp what our perceptions of constructs are as well.
Yeah. So does attachment apply only to the kinds of relationships we establish with our own parents and later on our romantic partners, or also to other kinds of relationships, like, for example, friendships?
I argue that true relationship and attachment bonds are only between reliable caregivers and romantic partners. That is not necessarily the consensus view. So there are, if you, set up a Google Scholar alert for attachment, you'll see attachment to everything under the sun, which is one of my critiques of the literature. Friendship is a common one. So like best friends are common to be invoked as an attachment figure, especially in the kind of middle childhood transition out of childhood into kind of puberty and adolescence, which is an area in attachment research we know very, very little about. Middle childhood is kind of this very neglected area within the literature. And so there's hypotheses proposed that these attachments to parents kind of get transferred over to friends as almost like practice runs for figuring out how to interact with romantic partners as puberty unfolds. So we can measure that. People measure attachment to God or other religious figures, for example. Attachments, measured for teachers, for example, for young kids, that's a common one as well. Again, you can give a measure and insert a person or a figure into the measure, and people are going to fill out and you're going to get a number out. Whether that theoretically makes sense, I argue no. Obviously, a large proportion of researchers argue yes, otherwise they wouldn't be doing the research on it. But I think that these different features of attachment that characterize attachment, such as, the safe haven, so knowing that that person is kind of a safe person that you can explore and try new things around, that emotional connection, those needs that you get, those key characteristics that define an attachment bond, take 1 to 2 years to develop. So we know that in infants, we know that there's some earlier research from the early 2000s that suggested that in adults as well. So I don't think, projecting attachment, friends as attachment figures or teachers as attachment figures conceptually makes sense. Again, you can measure it, but what's the theoretical argument behind it? And my recent paper looking at the nature of attachment systems is a key piece that I argue, where if we're looking at true attachment bonds in, kind of an adaptive sense, an evolutionary perspective, that it really only makes sense. We only have solid arguments for adults to form these full-fledged attachment bonds with regular caregivers and with romantic partners. So that's my, point, my perspective, that we only form those attachments with those types of figures, these true attachments, although we may have attachment-like features, sometimes projected onto other types of individuals, but typically they don't form these full-fledged attachment bonds. So that's my thoughts on it, at least.
Yeah. So just to provide our discussion with a bit of historical context, what would you say are some of the main ways that modern attachment theory differs from the original attachment theory as developed by John Bowlby?
Yeah, so this is an area that my reading of it, which some disagree with, but my reading of it is that I think attachment theory has gotten a little too big. So attachment theory, again, if you set up these Google Scholar alerts, we have attachment is correlated with pretty much anything you can think of within psychology. And I don't read that as what Bowlby's original interpretation was. I think, Bowlby is interesting because he had that kind of behavioral ecology type background and influence on the work that he did, obviously mirroring the infant and maternal, specifically, attachment across mammals. We know this, across all sorts of mammal species. So humans are no different in that regard. So he was really original in having that comparative approach. But I think some of the kind of cradle to grave terminology from some of Bowlby's original writings have been over-applied, I think, in my opinion, that we need to make a difference between the attachment systems or attachment bonds. What are the selection pressures that gave rise to these attachment adaptations? What are the mechanisms that are maintaining and refining those over evolutionary history? And what theoretically makes sense to form an attachment bond to? And I think that we have gotten a little too broad, whereas if we actually step back and kind of trim the fluff off of the application and reach of attachment theory and really focus on those selective pressures in that evolutionary perspective, we can kind of whittle down what attachment theory makes sense to apply to. So that's where I think things differ a little bit. And that's kind of the main argument that I was making in my Nature of Attachment Systems paper, is we need to think carefully through what are these selection pressures and evolutionary processes over time. Because how do we explain that with teachers? For example, that may be, a mismatch kind of hypothesis, or I haven't really thought carefully through it because I don't think that it makes much sense on the surface. But so I think we're a little too broad, where we're just kind of correlating attachment with a bunch of things, and it's not necessarily super informative. I think it makes sense if we kind of narrow it down and really try to understand why we're even forming attachments in the first place, because humans take it for granted that we form these close emotional bonds with romantic partners, but that's very atypical across animal species. Very few mammals in particular form these kind of pair bonds that we see in humans. So it's unique, it's interesting, and we need to think a little bit more carefully through even just that kind of piece before we start applying these attachment bonds everywhere else. Because what is the evolutionary reason why an attachment bond should exist? That should be kind of question one before we correlate our attachment styles with whatever other outcome. So that's my perspective.
Yeah. So from an evolutionary perspective, do you think we should think about attachment styles as adaptations?
I think so. I think humans, I have very little to argue or critique or present some new perspectives on infant attachment. It's pretty clear. Mammals form very close bonds with, especially their mothers. It's a fundamental need for, survival with young infants. And then we have these kind of social, emotional benefits that have arose over time as well, especially for humans. Now, when we look at adults, though, like I mentioned, it's atypical that we form attachment bonds, these close emotional relationships with another romantic partner. Most species don't do this. Most mammals don't do this. It is more common in primates, though, across the board, which is interesting. Why is that the case? And I think we need to ask ourselves, under what conditions would this make sense for attachment to be an adaptation? So the hypothesis that I've been advancing for, why attachment bonds are an adaptation for adult humans, specifically these romantic attachment bonds, is in part, or at least the initial selection pressure that started driving this in the human lineage, was infanticide protection. Now, what we know from comparative work in primates, that infanticide protection via, a consistent male partner is a reliable way to counter that infanticide risk. So humans are particularly prone to this, especially primates in general, because there tends to be longer dependency periods in primates. They are feeding from their mother for a much longer period of time than, like a puppy would or something along those lines. And primates, even our closest primate relatives, such as chimpanzees and bonobos and gorillas, it takes a long time for maturity. And especially humans have an even longer period of time. So that dependency, if we have a consistent male partner, one, decreases the risk of an unrelated male coming in and killing the infant while they're still feeding. And then it also can allow, with that reliable protection, actually a decrease in the breastfeeding period of time for humans, which is why we are actually able to have more offspring at a shorter interbirth ratio than do chimpanzees, for instance. So women tend to have babies every 2 to 3 years, whereas chimpanzees take several more years in between their offspring births, because they don't have a reliable male partner to kind of offer that protection and allow for that, those benefits of having more offspring with shorter ratios. So I think from an evolutionary perspective, there's a strong argument in favor of that hypothesis that I want to, advance and, make a little bit more mainstream in the attachment literature for humans.
Yeah, and in that case, protection from infanticide, why is that so important in our evolutionary history? Is that because males who resorted to infanticide perhaps had more readily sexual access to the women who had those children?
Yeah, so with primates in particular, because primates have, and especially apes, have these kind of key life history characteristics, such as a long breastfeeding time, longer juvenile period until maturity, that it's advantageous for a male to come in and kill an offspring while they're still nursing, because then the woman can become fertile again and be able to become pregnant again. So it's beneficial for an unrelated male to do that, which we see happen in chimpanzees. For instance, if a new, or gorillas, if a new male kind of takes over that alpha male spot in the group, if they're still nursing infants, they run a very high risk of being killed because they're unrelated to that male, and it's not beneficial for the male to sit around and wait for that female to become able to have another offspring. So having that reliable male partner is it's not the only counter infanticide strategy, if you will, but it is one that is reliable. And there's some great comparative work suggesting that pair bonding is a reliable solution in humans and other primates. And this is, evolved in about, across the primate order in about 10 different kind of families of species. And we have other evidence as well to suggest that it's a very stable strategy. So once pair bonding evolves, it's hard to, evolve into a different strategy over time. So it seems to be very reliable and very stable, which does make it a good candidate for, a strong selection pressure that may give rise to the type of pair bonding and attachments we see in humans.
So, in your work, I read about environmental unpredictability. What is that, and does it have any relationship with attachment?
Yeah, so environmental unpredictability is a construct that is typically used in the life history literature. And within evolutionary psychology, attachment theory is very intertwined with life history theory in a lot of ways. So life history theory is this general kind of developmental framework that evolutionary psychologists use to understand most often sexual behavior and maturity, because these are these key life history characteristic traits. So at what age do you actually reach maturity? When do you start engaging in sexual behaviors? When do you have your first offspring? Kind of these key, reproductive milestones. And so life history theory is this developmental framework, and attachment theory has come into the kind of framework in the late 2000s. I believe Jeffrey Simpson was one of the first types of papers and scientists that I read that actually got me interested in attachment theory, was this kind of integration of how life history theory can help us understand attachment. And from in the psychology and behavioral sciences literature, life history theory kind of has two constructs that are used to understand early rearing environments, which are unpredictability, as you mentioned, which is how variable or how reliable is the environment? Is it consistently unsafe? Do you have food sometimes and not other times? Are your caregivers sometimes really reliable and dependent and then kind of, are aloof for a long period of time? So unpredictability is really getting at the level of reliability and variation in the environment. Whereas the other construct that's used is harshness. So harsh environments are typically, more stressful to, grow up in, but at least it's predictable. Like, it's consistently harsh. So a harsh environment is typically defined as something consistently harsh, whereas unpredictable environments are on the negative side, but it's a little bit more variable. Now, the framework that integrates attachment and life history theory proposes that this unpredictability, we can kind of conceptually map that onto anxious attachment, if you will. So an early paper I did in graduate school looked at the self-reports of environmental unpredictability and how that correlates with later adult romantic attachments. And we typically find a consistent correlation between that unpredictability in the environment and that anxious attachment in adulthood, which tends to be characterized as a more, you're a little bit more in relationships, a little bit more chronically jealous, a little bit more suspicious of your partner, a little bit more insecure, using other terms as well. So we typically see within that framework that the unpredictability is more likely to lead to anxious or be correlated with anxious. And the idea is that the harsh environment, if it's always bad, it's adaptive in a way to disconnect, and that typically maps onto more of that avoidant attachment. So that's that framework and how that all works together. I've become a little bit more skeptical of it over the years as I've published more in that area, simply because I'm a little bit more skeptical in general of those long-term impacts of the early environment on romantic attachments. Nonetheless, the correlation's there, but what it really means and is it an artifact of measurement or an artifact of, behavior genetics, genetic confounding? These are all questions that I've become a little bit more interested in and have led me to be a little bit more skeptical of those long-term connections over time.
But in this case, unpredictable and harsh environments, do they refer only to the kinds of relationships children, for example, have with other people, or also other aspects of their lives?
Typically, in the attachment way, it does typically correlate or is conceptualized to impact the parental and infant attachment. So there is some work that I cited in that early paper that was actually some comparative experiments that went on where they made the food availability unpredictable or, kind of consistently low. And it did find that, which, these experiments can't do in humans, so, it's valuable. But they did find that in the unpredictable food environment, so picture yourself as an adult and you have a small offspring and food availability is very unpredictable. Sometimes you have the resources to get that food, sometimes you don't. And what they found is that unpredictability did influence the parenting behavior. So that individual, that parent was, less reliable for the infant. And what they found is that the anxiety in that infant tended to be higher. I think it was up to 4 years later. So there is some comparative evidence that if you manipulate the aspects of the rearing environment, they impact parenting, which then impacts the attachment development with that parent. Now, if we want to, whether we make that leap that attachment to the parent that is influenced by the environment, then jumps 15 years later to the romantic partner, it's a big jump. But it's a hypothesis worth investigating, absolutely. But I've become a little bit more skeptical of it, but it's a very reasonable thing to be looking at.
Mm-hmm. And also, I guess, since we also mentioned behavioral genetics, there would be an element of differential susceptibility, and perhaps different people would deal with unpredictable, harsh, and secure environments in different ways.
Yeah, exactly. That's a big perspective of kind of the Jay Belsky group of attachment and development, and some of the hypotheses surrounding life history theory is that, and Bruce Ellis as well, their kind of perspective is that some children are more sensitive to stress than other children, which may make them react to the same type of environment in different ways and therefore affect their development differently, and then, long-term outcomes. But again, if we want to be a little skeptical of that hypothesis, why is that child a little more sensitive to stress? Is the parent passing on some similar kind of stress, sensitivity that also may be correlated with these other traits in a genetic sense as well? So, that genetic confounding idea where we, kind of need to take strongly into account the relationship between the parent, the genetic relationship between the parent and the offspring, is really, really important. It's difficult to do. We have some ways that I've used in some of my papers to address some simulation modeling. If we have enough, quality data from the literature, we can at least provide some estimates to the extent to which genetic confounding may be explaining at least some of the correlation that we're seeing between, a parent's behavior and a child's behavior, for instance. But without, high-powered, children of twins design and, large family studies, which, if executed properly, are wildly informative for these kind of questions, but they're very, very challenging to do. So, Bruce Ellis has, pioneered that, kind of children of siblings and children of twins design, and has come up with some very interesting results from that. But, it still kind of goes back to that point that I was mentioning earlier with, the small sample sizes with these studies, because they're just really hard to get long-term studies with multiple members of a family over many years. It's really hard to do. And, great for him that he's able to even get, some of these studies done, because it's very challenging. I don't have the resources to do those kind of studies. But we do need to take those possibilities seriously. So I think having some simulation estimates that at least if you run a more typical kind of standard social science model study where we're just kind of self-reporting and correlations, we don't have that genetic data to control for, it's worth, at least mentioning that up to maybe half of this relatively small or moderate correlation may, kind of be spurious. And, it doesn't mean that correlation isn't true. It doesn't mean that effect may not be there, but it just may be, smaller than we originally thought, which is useful. But we definitely need to take genetic correlations and confounding more seriously with these developmental studies.
Mm-hmm. Now talking specifically about attachment applied to romantic relationships, is there any correlation between certain attachment styles and intimate partner violence?
Yeah, so this is an area that I spent a lot of time researching. This was actually the topic of my doctoral dissertation that I did. And this started off with kind of a few different steps. So early on in graduate school, I was interested in how these romantic attachment relationships were correlated to these mate retention behaviors. And mate retention we typically define in kind of two broad categories of benefit provisioning and cost inflicting, with the benefit provisioning be all the nice things that we do for our partners and tell them we love them and compliment them and, do things to make them happy and satisfied in the relationship. Whereas on the other side, we have these cost inflicting behaviors, which are kind of maybe some commitment manipulation, like, ultimatums, for instance. Emotional manipulations could be, getting mad at your partner, having fights with your partner, telling them, negative things, kind of insulting them. And, kind of the idea is like decreasing their kind of self-worth. So alternatives, kind of changing that perspective of how they fit in with those alternatives. And so my initial research on this showed very robust and strong correlations between attachment anxiety in particular, which, remember, is also highly correlated with this idea of neuroticism, with personality. And there's these very strong correlations between attachment anxiety and these negative partner-directed behaviors, which are these manipulative kind of behaviors. And so, and when I say large correlations, I'm talking like 0.5, 0.6. These are big correlations for social science research. And so that was my initial clue that, this is a really robust correlation. We should look into this more. So after I established some of the mate retention work, which I've replicated in a few US samples, in an Iranian sample, and then currently one of our papers that I have up as a preprint is looking at it in a dyadic sample, and that is with participants in the US and then also with participants in German-speaking countries as well, so Germany and Austria in particular. And we've replicated this study, or this finding, across all these different kind of cultural contexts and also in a dyadic context as well. And so what I focused on for my dissertation was, if we see that anxious attachment, so someone that's chronically jealous, someone that is suspicious of their partner, that thinks they're sneaking around, if that's related to manipulative behaviors, might it also be related to more aggressive, physical violent behavior, sexually violent behaviors? So we looked at that, just in a kind of simple self-report study, and found these robust correlations. In the dyadic study that I ran as part of my dissertation, we asked individuals about their attachment relationships, and various forms of intimate partner violence found that relationship there as well. And then I did some simulation studies to identify kind of get at a quasi-causal evidence of to what extent that relationship may be explained by genetic factors. Like, is it a spurious correlation, or is it more of a probable or causal relationship, which that research suggests that a small portion of it may be attributed to genetic overlap, but it is mostly a, real and reliable correlation. So we don't see much relationship between avoidant attachment and negative behaviors, which is kind of counter to some of the social psychological literature that says, like, this disconnected, emotionally distant man is the one that is, like, violent towards their partner, which my research suggests that's not the case. If someone's uninterested, then, why put so much effort into being interested in the partner, even if it's in a negative way? So a lot of different lines of research I've done over my graduate studies suggest that anxious attachment mediated by jealousy and perceptions of infidelity, which from an evolutionary perspective make a lot more sense for why those would predict these psychologically, physically, and sexually aggressive behaviors.
Since you mentioned samples from different countries, this question just popped into my head now. Have these attachment styles been cross-culturally validated?
Yeah, so there is a lot of research in infants, for example, that have done cross-cultural validation. So it seems to be like those four kind of styles that we've talked about before tend to be pretty reliable across different types of countries and different cultural contexts. The adult attachment questionnaires, the self-report measures that we typically use, I'm not aware of super robust validation research outside of kind of these weird, Western educated, industrialized, democratic countries. I'm not sure how this looks in more anthropological, typical type samples. but I assume there's similar dimensions. But, when we look at mating systems, for example, and what marriages are based on and pair bonds are based on, those vary pretty widely across cultural contexts. So I think the westernized weird view that attachment is like love and, it's this love and commitment and this emotional bond may be a limited view of how we're conceptualizing attachment. In my Nature of Attachment Systems paper, I try to emphasize the fact that we can look at attachment bonds as a kind of evaluation of resource investment for some sort of benefit, which sounds really cold and calculating when we think about a partnership and relationship. And yes, in Western countries, we typically, find someone that we love and, all these wonderful things and all the emotions and feelings. But really also when it comes down to it, do you share the same values? Do you have the same vision of your life? How can two people come together and do more than you can do with just that one person for a lot of different kind of economic benefits and, lifelong kind of perspective on, hey, this is a good partner for me. We share a lot of the same values. We get along really well. How can we, move forward as a partnership? So I think viewing attachment, romantic attachment specifically as more of this partnership is casts a little bit more accurate, wider net than, just this pure Western love idea that comes out of the attachment literature. So I'd be interested to see kind of how that research unfolds over time, and I hope it does.
Yeah, I've asked you that because since I interviewed Joe Henrik last year on the weirdest people in the world, I'm always mindful of these issues. So
yeah. It's good to be, yeah.
Okay, so another thing that you wrote about recently is the effects of spanking on psychological outcomes, in this case applied to children. So could you tell us about that?
Yeah, this was an interesting study. This was supposed to be a brief side project that turned into multiple years. It's one of the biggest papers that I've actually done. I think it ended up honestly being more complex and big than my dissertation was. And this was, again, just this little side project that I became very invested in. These typically, none of my other research focuses on spanking. So the focus of the research, although, topically is on spanking, it was really to try to get at this bigger question and point that has become a little bit more mainstream in the literature in the last 5 years or so, is that when we look at the effects of parenting behavior on child outcomes over development, is it causal? The implicit assumption is that it is. If a parent spanks a child, it will lead to all these negative developmental outcomes. And all the research, or the bulk of the research up into this point, is all correlational. It is standard social science methods. We ask the parent, have you spanked your child? And then, we observe, externalizing behavior or internalizing behavior or mental health problems in the child at various ages. We see negative correlations, and therefore evidence is consistent with a causal interpretation that because, obviously the parenting behavior comes first and then the outcomes come later. We have this robust correlation and it intuitively makes sense. So we were interested in, kind of questioning that, should these robust negative relationships we see between parenting behavior and child outcomes across, all these different traits, is that a reliable outcome? Like, is that, the effect size that we should trust? And what really motivated the paper was a couple things. A meta-analysis had just come out on that topic. So that meta-analysis took all this different kind of body of literature across, I think it was 17 different kind of outcomes ranging from, child mental health behavior, their externalizing behavior, their negative relationship with their parent, all these different kind of developmental psychosocial outcomes that psychologists are interested in. And it's a very robust meta-analysis, and there is a consistent negative relationship. And the conclusions from the paper are that the evidence is consistent with the idea that spanking has a negative impact on children's psychological development. And some of the reasons for that are that there's no documented positive cases. So I want to make that clear. Spanking your child doesn't seem to have any positive outcomes to it, and there's no studies that show a positive relationship. Spanking isn't really, associated with like well-adjusted children necessarily. But although we see a consistent negative relationship, is it causal or consistent with a causal interpretation? And one way to get at this is, as I mentioned before, behavior genetic studies, and the problem is that behavior genetic studies in spanking area, in the spanking literature, just like the attachment literature, are very limited. In that recent paper, we reviewed all of the studies, and it's like 5 of them. So there's not very many. And what those papers do show, those few papers, and then we also added another sample, a twin or sibling sample, to add to those genetic estimates. And we show that there is a consistently negative relationship, but a proportion of that correlation between the parenting spanking behavior and the child's negative outcomes can be attributed to just shared genetic variance. But there is still a substantial larger portion of that correlation that is attributable to non-shared environmental variance in particular, which is consistent with kind of this quasi-causal interpretation of that relationship. So our general conclusion was that, yes, spanking tends to be associated with negative psychosocial outcomes, but the effect of it is smaller than what we're typically used to hearing. So we're not claiming spanking's good or spanking is neutral. It is still negative, but the effect size is smaller, which we think is an important conclusion. And that's, there's one exception to that finding, and that is spanking and its association with further physical violence. So not spanking, which is defined as, like an open hand, slap on the butt, basically. If you're in a household that is doing that, the risk of physical violence from the parent is high. And that shows a different relationship, and that shows a shared environmental effect, which is very abnormal because, again, that's kind of unique in the psychological literature. So even if you're in a household where your sibling is spanked a lot, but you're not, you still have an equal risk, essentially, of incurring physical violence. And that's an interesting finding as well. So we're hoping the paper, gets some traction once it's officially published. We think it's an important, finding, but it's been a little bit of a struggle to get that paper out for a variety of reasons from reviewers. So, but we're hoping that it's useful for people.
Yeah, sure. So how do you look at the relationship between evolutionary psychology and behavioral genetics?
That's a really good question. My view is that behavior genetics and evolutionary psychology have really kind of evolved in parallel to one another over the years. The twin method and, Tooby and Cosmides, the adapted mind, kind of came about, around the same times. The 70s and 80s were kind of the big birth of these two useful, interesting disciplines, a new way to look at human behavior. Yet they both kind of just gone in parallel to one another with very little interaction between the two. And I think it's unfortunate because I think a lot of interesting research in behavioral genetics, can inform how we think about how traits evolved over time. A key point to evolution is that there needs to be variation, and that variation is genetic variation. It's a key component. We can't ignore it. Yet we have all this genetic information on human behavior, and we're not applying it as widely as I think we should to understand how traits have evolved. How are they undergoing positive selection, negative selection, balancing selection? Like, there's questions that we can answer about how traits have evolved that genetics and behavioral genetic data can inform us about. So I think they're useful for one another, but I don't think they're applied as widely because typically psychology programs don't train you in genetic methods. So you kind of have to read on your own and take kind of broad implications to it. Very few people have the skill set to do both. And that's a consequence of just, the training programs aren't necessarily integrated as well. But I think they can offer a lot of benefits to one another if we keep asking questions about how traits evolve, just in addition to whether they are adaptations or not, or understanding characteristics of the adaptation. For those kind of questions, genetics isn't as relevant. But if we're looking at how did that trait evolve, super relevant question.
So, do you think that perhaps through behavioral genetics, and if we try to integrate it with evolutionary psychology, we could get new insights into perhaps the sorts of the sorts of selection pressures we were subject to during our evolutionary history?
I think so, and I think probably the best area to look at where this integration is happening is in psychopathology research, because we typically have, typically in like genetics research, we ask a lot of medical-based questions because they feel a little more concrete than like adding an attachment question or something to, these giant genetic databases. So we do have more information on medical, psychopathology type traits, like schizophrenia is one. I don't do research in the area of schizophrenia or psychopathology really at all, but I think the genetic research and the implications for what we know about how schizophrenia has evolved is a really nice like case study for the benefits of how behavioral genetics can influence evolutionary psychology. And we can see from that literature that typically schizophrenia is undergoing more negative selection based on what we know about behavioral genetics. And I recently wrote a chapter with Lars Penke about, behavioral genetic methods, which kind of just outlines those basic methods. But in the end, we offer some ways that behavioral genetics can offer some insight to evolutionary psychology, such as how traits have evolved. And if we're doing evolutionary work, which requires genetic variation, it seems a little odd if we're not fully integrating those two fields together over time.
So I have here one last question that comes from a patron, Bernard Seixas, and it's a very interesting one. So it's about attachment. Classical attachment theory has not incorporated Robert Trivers's parental investment theory. Do you think using parental investment theory would drastically change the way we see attachment?
That is a good point. It's not something I've totally thought very carefully through just because I haven't thought, or I just don't spend as much time on the parenting aspect of it. But I think where, I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head now, but where that could come into play in a really useful way is we have a lot of information on the parent-infant attachment relationship. And it's very infant-centered. It's very child-centered in the research. Like, what are the impacts on the child? What is the child's attachment? But there is some interesting research. I believe it's been published in Developmental Psychology, the journal, because I've reviewed a couple of papers on this aspect, is they have looked at how the romantic partner's attachment changes before and after the birth of their first child, which is really interesting. And they do not mention Trivers' work in that because it's more of a traditional developmental journal. But I think this could influence how we operationalize, how we conceptualize what that attachment is. So I mentioned with my romantic attachment work that I operationalize attachment as more of this kind of mechanical resource. If I keep investing into this, am I getting an optimal outcome for the amount of time and energy and resources I'm investing into that relationship? And, I propose that once that balance is, off, when I feel like I'm investing too much and not getting, what I think I should back, typically a relationship dissolves at that point. And I wonder how we could apply Trivers' thinking to how we understand parent-infant attachments from the parental perspective, because we're so focused on the child perspective. And I think too, with, my perspective that I put out with romantic attachments is that when we think about, the benefits of having a child, obviously it's, evolutionary advantageous to have a child. It's kind of the point. We need to think of what that means for the relationship partners. So we're kind of equally investing in a way, genetically speaking, at least into this offspring. So I think I think that'd be interesting. I haven't thought too much to it. I haven't read anything on applying Trivers' parental investment theory to attachment. I think it's a great question, and it's definitely going to keep me thinking about that moving forward. So I appreciate the question from the patron for sure.
Yeah, I have great patrons, including you. So
Happy to see.
yeah, okay. So where can people find you on the internet?
You can find me all over the internet. You can find me on Twitter at Nicole Barbaro, and you can find me online at NicoleBarbaro.com. And you can also newly find me on Substack at NicoleBarbaro.substack.com. So if you Google Nicole Barbaro, you can probably find all my associated accounts. So I appreciate
Okay.
checking out.
Okay, great. So thank you again for taking the time, and I hope to have you on the show again somewhere in the future.
Happy to come back, and thanks for having me for a second time. It's been wonderful.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting it on Patreon or PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of the interview. The show is brought to you by people like you, so consider doing it. Otherwise, and if you like the interview, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litske and Blanchett, Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Pauline Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingart, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Nguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Yugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omer Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslo Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W. João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Ethan Solon, Roman Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Miran B, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Max Bowlby, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz. My producers is Arweb, Jim, Frank, Lucas Staffini, Kian Gilligan, Sergio Codreano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanegdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Nirvan Balachandran. And my executive producers, Michelle Rzeski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.